Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Where the words constitutional crisis are hoving into view on the horizon. Whether we're there yet or not is... It might be moot, actually. Some experts would say that we are. Others would argue categorically that we're not. But I don't think anybody... Well, who knows? But I don't think anybody could argue that this is in any way a democratic process that we are potentially seeing unfold in the course of today. I want your thoughts. I will share mine. I don't have a clear bead on what lies ahead. All I do know is that arguing that parliamentary sovereignty had somehow been compromised by membership of the European Union and therefore we must leave the European Union seems a rather strange precursor to a decision by a Prime Minister charged with delivering that exit from the European Union to suspend that sovereign parliament, doesn't it? But hey, I'm going to start slightly untraditionally on the programme by going straight to a guest. Andrew Sentence is a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. And I won't detain you unduly, Andrew, but I wonder if you could just talk us through what has happened to the pound this morning and why.
Well, I think whenever we see uncertainty related to Brexit and also related to the political situation in the UK, the pound reflects that, and it's fallen. Not too dramatically, but by about a cent against the dollar.
Would we expect that to be sustained during the day?
Quite possibly, because it's not clear what the outcome of this sort of story is, whether the story is firmly based. It's appeared on the BBC website, so it presumably has some veracity, but whether it's a definite plan or an option that's being considered is not yet clear.
The sources now coalescing at Sky News and the BBC, and I've put in a couple of calls myself this morning, it perhaps not copper-bottomed, but certainly a very thick veneer of copper being applied to the bottom of the story. In your view, what would certainty look like in the current context?
Well, I think it's clear that if this is the story is correct,
yes, of course,
it's clear that the government will attempt to do this. Whether they'll succeed or not is another matter. So there is still a lot of uncertainty about the political situation and about Brexit. It's worth recalling, though, that the pound has been pretty weak for a long period of time. 120 against, or just above 120 against the dollar, compares with a sort of par value that we had before the financial crisis until quite recently, 165. And against the euro, we tended to move 130, 140. We're now down probably below 110. So the pound has been weak for some time. This is just adding to the uncertainty that foreign exchange dealers are reacting to.
I think when I asked you what certainty might look like, I was sort of possibly overly optimistically hoping you might describe what the light at the end of the tunnel looks like. But is it fair to say that perhaps at this point in proceedings nobody really knows?
I think the answer is nobody really knows, partly because insofar as anything relates to Parliament is not sitting at the moment.
Sure.
But it's only when Parliament is reconvened that we'll have a clearer picture about how Parliament will express its views.
And whatever may transpire next, if it is definitive, a no-deal Brexit, a kamikaze Brexit, call it what you will, if it's definitive and that is the new reality with which markets and businesses will have to deal, that in an odd way would constitute better news than what we're currently contemplating.
Well, I'm not sure it would,
right,
because there are both...
Just trying to be balanced, Andrew.
Yes. Quite right. There are both short-term and long-term sides from a no-deal Brexit. The short-term is obviously the disruption that everyone's been talking about, possibly affecting food supplies, medicines, etc., and our trade more generally. But it's also worth focusing on the long-term consequences of a no-deal Brexit. If the UK is unable to forge a Brexit deal with its major trading partners in Europe, one, it won't very easily, if at all, be able to have a future deal with those trading partners. And it's going to, secondly, impact on our credibility with other countries and our ability to strike trade deals with them. Because a country that just pulls away with no deal from one of its long-standing trading and economic and political relationships is not going to be very creditworthy in the world of international economics and politics.
And of course, reneging on perceived financial commitments would only add to that particular mess. Finally, Andrew Sanders, and a personal view, I suspect, how much significance do you attach? There's a lot of chatter about people, some of whom are reported to have donated to Boris Johnson's various campaigns, people who are heavily invested in the decline of the pound. Are they just sort of pirates on the fringes of the story, or do they perhaps have a finger on steering wheels?
I don't know about that. You get all these sort of conspiracy theories around. Throughout this whole Brexit episode, going back to 2016, the pound has been a pretty good barometer of sentiment towards the UK. And the more volatility, the more uncertainty there is, the more it's reflected in the decline in the pound, the more likely a bad scenario following Brexit becomes. That is then also factored into the value of the pound. It's not surprising to see the pound falling now. Indeed.
Andrew Sanders, many thanks indeed. Andrew, of course, a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Is anyone claiming that 17.4 million people voted for this yet? I'm not being sarcastic anymore. I presume they are. I can see this news has been greeted with delight by Twitter accounts that delight in names like Voice of Reason and Protect the Christian West, but we will confine ourselves this morning to people who at least have a scintilla of rationality about themselves. 10 minutes after 10 is the time. The thing is, Boris Johnson hasn't been elected by the country, nor, of course, was Theresa May when she assumed the position in Downing Street, but she did go to the country shortly afterwards, which means that the manifesto upon which that election was fought remains in place. To talk of a new government, I think, is wrong, because there's nothing new about this government. It's a Conservative government. They've changed their leader, but it was the Conservative Party that emerged after bunging £1 billion to the DUP as the party able to command a majority in the House of Commons, and that simple fact remains, I think, the rationale on which Boris Johnson's premiership rests. So when I see on social media this morning luminaries such as James Cleverly, the chairman of the Conservative Party, claiming that there is a new government and that therefore the Queen's speech is a perfectly normal and natural course of events, well, I just find myself wondering what's going on. It's not. I mean, if it's a new government, then the manifesto doesn't apply and nobody's got a mandate to do anything. If it's not a new government, then what the hell are they playing at? Very strange times indeed. 11 minutes after 10. I'm going to do a side order of what you think is going on. Apparently Bill Cash earlier, when talking to Tom Swarbrick, did indeed claim that this is what 17.4 million people voted for. A statement which, it pains me deeply to say, is absolutely dripping with absurdity, but in the current context of Brexit, it seems relatively par for the course. 17.4 million people voted to suspend Parliament because they had been persuaded that Parliament had lost its powers as a result of membership of the European Union. I'm just going to pause and say that again, because this is our home and they're setting it on fire, okay? 17.4 million people voted to restore parliamentary power by putting a Prime Minister in Downing Street, supported by a tiny, tiny, tiny slither of the population, who then elected to suspend Parliament. Now, 12 minutes after 10 is the time. Phone lines are open. 0345 60 60 973. Would you use the words constitutional crisis at this point? What do you think the plan is? Goodness knows. Goodness only knows. Anyone pretending to be clear or certain on this is, I think, yanking your chain or deluding themselves. But, of course, people who are deluding themselves are the petrol upon which the engine of Brexit continues to chug along. And this gives them something to cheer. Brexit, since pretty much the day of the referendum result, has been about giving people who don't really understand what's going on something to cheer. So they were cheering not long ago, Brexit means Brexit. They were cheering not long ago, they need us more than we need them. They were cheering not long ago, the German car industry will come to our rescue. There's no way that the French or the Germans will allow their trade with the United Kingdom to be compromised or diminished. They were claiming not long ago that the British border in Ireland was a problem that could be very easily solved. They just couldn't tell you how yet. At every point in this ridiculous story, The people who, and I don't know how many of them there are, you'd sort of chalk them up as the UKIP contingent, because that is the rump of the electorate that determines whether or not the Conservative Party survives in its current form or not. Keeping, you could put it simply as, they've got to keep the racists sweet. And it's middle-class racists, of course. It's chalk-striped suit-wearing race. They've got to keep them sweet. Otherwise, the Conservative Party crumbles. That is the rump of the electorate that delivered Brexit. Wouldn't have got over the line without the racists. No one has ever suggested that everybody that voted for Brexit was a racist, but I've never met a racist that didn't vote for Brexit. So keeping them sweet is the top priority. No deal Brexit is what they're currently pretending they wanted all along, despite the fact that their cheerleaders insisted throughout the referendum that it was either an impossibility or a conclusion devoutly to be resisted. Doesn't matter. Truth doesn't matter. All that matters is giving people who don't really know what's going on, but don't really like foreigners or Brussels or the EU, can't tell you why they don't like it, or if they try to, they come out with ludicrous lines like protect the Christian West or sovereignty. They've got to be kept sweet. How are you going to keep them sweet? Well, doesn't matter how. Just do something. So today they'll be cheering the suspension of Parliament without really understanding what matters, without really understanding what it means, without really understanding why it's happening, but it will be offered up as a way of edging ever closer to the only Brexit that remains in play, the Brexit that they can't describe because it's no deal, which means, and you can write this down, no detail. No deal Brexit is a no detail Brexit, because the minute you ask for detail, the whole thing falls apart. How can Boris Johnson keep this balloon inflated today? Let's just suspend Parliament. And I know a lot of people will be very upset and very troubled by what's happening, and I know an awful lot of people who don't understand anything will think that they're delighted by what's happening. They'll be shouting words like democracy and sovereignty, but whatever you do, don't ask them what those words mean, because that would make you condescending and sneering. And I apologise for being a bit of an anorak, but this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, this is just unprecedented in its complication and interest. And this is, I mean, in many ways, these are once-in-a-lifetime political episodes and political events. Nobody knows what is going to happen next. Downing Street have decided to suspend Parliament. We are fairly confident of that. Any changes on that, I will share with you. I don't even know, and you may think less of me as a result of this admission, I don't even know whether the Queen's allowed to say no. Well, they asked to suspend Parliament. Can the Queen say no? Queen becomes pawn, as I'm Incorrigible has just suggested with a rather fetching chess analogy. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's highly unlikely, but that's the point about a constitutional crisis. We don't have a written constitution in this country, which means that events are not plottable. They are not predictable according to codified and formal documents. So who the hell knows? Why are they doing it? I think the short answer is to delight that 15 to 20% of the voting electorate who are desperate to leave the European Union. They don't know why. The reasons that they give for doing so fall apart under scrutiny, but that doesn't matter. Their votes count as much as a vote of Michael Heseltine. Their vote is worth as much as the vote of the cleverest woman or man in the country. Their vote is worth exactly the same as yours. Just because they haven't really got a clue about what's going on doesn't change the fact that they hold the balance of power on the right wing of British politics. And if they don't fall behind Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, if they continue to flirt with the Brexit Company Limited, then the Conservatives are crippled when they go to the country. That is to whom I think this decision today, or this suggestion today, speaks most loudly. I think, but I really stress today, and the number one clip on the LBC website at the moment is me explaining in July of 2018 exactly why we would end up precisely where we are today. I'm not doing that anymore. I can't. I've got no clue about what's going to happen, because we don't have a written constitution. It is absolutely riveting, but I apologise for not being able to deliver today if you've tuned in looking for a clear bead and a clear line on what is going to happen next, because I told you at the beginning of 2019, as far as that goes, all bets are off, and the fact that we've now got a new Prime Minister makes that doubly so. Victoria is, in Greece. Victoria, what made you pick up the phone? I hope I'm not interrupting your holiday.
Yeah, you're not interrupting my holiday, but the Westminster seemed intent on... I came over for two reasons. One, I needed a new passport, and two, to escape the Brexit chaos. But unfortunately, it seems it absolutely has. And I just wanted to take a moment to paint a picture of what it feels like to be a human being with 3 children in the middle of this. Because over here, you can't apply for settled status without a current passport.
Correct.
So Greece only issues them for 5 years. So I've been traveling on my European D card. But look, I have a moral issue with applying for it because I consider myself a resident of Scotland. I consider myself a new Scot, and I have a moral issue with applying to Westminster for leave to stay. But my husband really doesn't want to leave Scotland. So I said, look, I'll go through the motions as if I'm going to do this, hoping that some magic, SMP-driven solution will save me from the indignity. So I come over here to get my passport. And since I've been here, which is only in early August, we've lost our health insurance. There's been all this chaos around the settled status scheme, and now he's shutting down Parliament. And every day I'm getting on the phone. So I'm here on my own. My husband, he works at sea.
Yes.
And I'm no flying back. And he's like, but you have to. The dog. My in-laws are watching our dog. He's like, they can't stay there forever. I was like, no, but you don't understand. Like, my first instinct as a mother is to protect my children. So explain to me in good conscience how I'm supposed to say, we're here in this apartment that I own outright. I'm going to take them back to the land of chaos and craziness.
I don't know. I don't know. I can't.
At the border?
I think at the border you'll be okay. But these are easy words for me to say, aren't they? Whereas for you, these are profoundly important issues that you want certainty on. It's funny that word certainty is so prevalent this morning. You talked about it in the context of the pound declining this morning in response to the news. Certainty is what businesses want. I suggested in good faith to the fellow formerly from the Bank of England that even if it's awful, even if we do the kamikaze thing, at least that will deliver certainty, and that will be better than what we've currently got. But he dismissed that. What to you, and don't say it looks like a train, James, because I've heard that joke too many times recently. For you, what does the light at the end of the tunnel look like?
I suppose the light at the end of the tunnel for me would look like an Indy Ref 2 date. That's the honest truth. Because
so Scotland gets out of the UK gets out of the EU, Scotland is no longer in the UK and seeks some sort of membership. So, because that's not really light at the end of it. That's just an extension of the tunnel, Victoria. That's tunnel 2.0.
No, I understand that. But the bottom line is, look, I have a degree in politics from the University of Glasgow.
Yes.
I'm not looking at this as, a complete neophyte on the concepts of democracy and politics.
Well, I think it might be as well. I'm not reaching. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying. I genuinely don't see a way for the United Kingdom as it currently exists to continue on. So what I'm looking at is what is the most realistic option for my family? What would my best case scenario look like? And I think that's it. And I honestly don't again that's going to happen in a timely enough fashion, because we're already discussing not only just me not going back, where we should go in the meantime, because our family needs certainty. I have 3 children who live in 7 countries. We went back to Scotland because we were told if we went back before this March 20th cliff date, we would have certainty. We would have a set of rules. They would be followed. None of that has come to fruition.
No.
So why would I gamble my family's future on what, in good faith, from this Tory government that at every juncture, at every opportunity, has made the wrong decision, has actively decided to disenfranchise us and make things worse?
I'm so glad that you've kicked us off today, because you remind us, and I feel doubly guilty for expressing my delight at how fascinating I find everything, because you've reminded me immediately that these are personal stories, personal tragedies, potentially, but that fundamental uncertainty. So I say to you, Catalaveno, signomi.
Look, can I just say on a side note before you let me go, I think you're brilliant, and thank you for being genuinely objective about Scottish independence.
You're very kind. It's a work in progress. Everything is a work in progress. 26 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Anyone celebrating this who doesn't really understand what's going on? 0345 60 60973. Anthony's in Colchester. Anthony, what made you pick up the phone?
Just basically because I think it's time that everybody realised that we had a vote, and that vote needs to be upheld, whether you voted to leave or voted to remain.
Yes. That's it, is it?
Oh no, I mean you spend a lot. You spend most of your days trying to convince people to change their direction.
No, Anthony, bless you, mate. I spend most of my days reminding you what people like this said 3 years ago.
We'll find ourselves part of the European Economic Area and with a free trade deal. I want us to have a simple free trade agreement with the European Union. If Norway, Iceland and Switzerland can get deals that suit them, we can do something far, far better than that. Norway chooses its own deal. We will choose our own deal. We're in a much stronger negotiating position than Norway ever has been.
So how have people ended up, you think, believing that they voted for no deal when the cheerleader of Brexit argued the precise opposite, Anthony?
Because of the way that Parliament has sent this, by taking the options away constantly. Don't forget, we had 3 years of Theresa May.
So you liked the deal, did you? You liked Theresa May's deal?
No, I didn't like Theresa May's deal at all.
But that's what 17.4 million people voted for.
No, 17.4 million people did not vote for that.
So what did they vote for then?
We voted for the £9 million leaflet that Cameron stuck for our letterboxes.
Pardon?
And Theresa May's deal did not represent what that leaflet had on it.
So I'm a little bit confused. 17.4 million people voted for David Cameron.
Well, no, we basically voted for what was on that leaflet.
What was on the leaflet?
We all know what was on the leaflet. It was to leave the...
But you voted to leave, and that leaflet was encouraging you to remain.
It was, yeah.
So you voted to leave because of what the Remain campaign said.
Don't confuse what I'm saying.
It's not me that's confusing you, Anthony.
The leaflet had on it, the options of what we would be leaving if we chose to leave.
Yeah, and what were those options?
We all know what they were, to leave the EU.
Right.
To stop paying into the...
But the withdrawal agreement involved... The withdrawal agreement involved leaving the EU.
It didn't. It held us into the EU unless we found certain solutions for the Irish backstop.
Which we still have to find.
We don't have to find, because the EU...
So how are we going to solve it then?
Nobody's going to put a hard border up, are they?
Oh,
everybody's already...
What happens if they do?
But everybody said that they won't.
Who said that they won't?
The Irish have said it, the English have said it. The only people that haven't said it is the European Union.
Anthony, I don't know how to say this politely, but you're talking undiluted twaddle.
Only in your opinion.
No, it's not an opinion, you see. It's not an opinion, because you voted you voted to leave the European Union because you believed the Remain campaign.
Well, no, not because I believed the Remain campaign, because I was given
I'll play you this again then. Did you believe this guy? Did you believe this guy, Anthony?
We'll find ourselves part of the European Economic Area and with a free trade deal. I want us to have a simple free trade agreement with the European Union. If Norway, Iceland and Switzerland can get deals that suit them, we can do something far, far better than that. Norway chooses its own deal. We will choose our own deal. We're in a much stronger negotiating position than Norway ever has been.
Or did you vote to suspend Parliament?
I don't agree with the suspending of Parliament.
But that's what we're talking about today. That's what you've rang in to discuss.
You've got to look at the reasons as to why Boris Johnson is doing that.
Yes.
Not just
because he can't admit that there is nothing better than being in the European Union. And that long list of the stuff that Farage... Well, just talk me through what Farage just said. Talk me through.
I honestly think that the reason that he's doing that is because he is upholding the will of the people.
But if those people voted to leave the European Union because they believe... Anthony, just pause for a minute, mate. Just hang on. I've got a question for you, please.
MPs in Parliament that have sculptured the old leaving the EU.
No, we haven't.
Because they don't agree. We have.
People who voted because they believed what Nigel Farage just said, how can that be their will?
I don't care what Farage said. I'm not interested in
what Farage said. No, but you appreciate that some people trust him and believe him. And they're the people you're talking about. So when you say the will, Anthony, no, of course they are. You're talking about 17.4 million people. You're claiming that they all want the same thing.
People that are in Parliament, were elected on the mandate, of their manifesto, which was to leave the European Union. Now you have a lot of MPs, that have stood on that mandate.
They didn't get an overall majority, though, did they?
It doesn't matter whether...
Well, that's how Parliament works.
No, that's how Parliament works. I'm talking about
Parliament.
Conservative MPs.
Well, you're talking about Parliament.
No, I'm talking about Conservative MPs.
In Parliament.
They may be in Parliament, but just the fact still remains, that they were elected on the manifesto of the government they stood for.
And the chairman of the party today says this is a new government, and if it's a new government, that manifesto no longer holds. Just before you go, because we're late for the news...
It's a new cabinet, not a new government.
No, the chairman of the Conservative Party said it was a new government, not me.
You're confusing.
I'll say it again. The chairman of the Conservative Party said it, not me. I don't agree with him. I think I agree with you. Final question, what are you most looking forward to about the no-deal crash-out at the end of October?
I don't truly believe that we'll be in a no-deal crash-out. The reason that we are in this no-deal crash-out mindset is simply because of the bad job that Theresa May...
So you're not looking forward to it?
I don't think there will be a bad crash-out, to be honest with you.
Right. And the will of the people... The will of the people is what?
When we go around full circle, we need the EU as much as the EU need us. Yeah, they need to trade with us, we need to trade with them, and I think that in the end things all
right, mate. You have a cracking day. I'm very grateful for your time and attention. It's 10:33. Here is the letter that Boris Johnson has sent to his colleagues. This morning, I'll edit it, obviously. This morning I spoke to Her Majesty the Queen to request an end to the current parliamentary session in the second sitting week in September before commencing the second session of this parliament with a Queen's speech on Monday the 14th of October. A central feature of the legislative programme will be the government's #1 legislative priority if a new deal is forthcoming at EU Council to introduce a withdrawal agreement bill and move at pace to secure its passage before 31st of October. Something which I think Anthony in Colchester came close to suggesting. The presumption, of course, would be that somehow that deal would get through Parliament in a way that previous deals have not. Constitutional crisis? Many people think so. People celebrating, I think you'd allow me to say, don't really know why they're celebrating, but it just seems to inflate further the no detail, no deal Brexit that is all they have left to cling to, the alternative being admitting a fairly grave error. I'm trying to think out who the grown-ups are, who you would turn to at a time like this and ask for a clear light to be shone into proceedings. I'd put my money on Matthew Parris, actually, so we shall see if we can rouse him. 10:39 is the time. Jack's in Brighton. Jack, what do you think?
Oh, it's an unmitigated disaster, James.
Is it?
Yes. Well, we voted to leave, unfortunately. 17.4 million voted to leave, but they voted to be exactly where we are now, in limbo. They didn't vote for a deal. They didn't vote for no deal. They voted to put it back to the House of Commons, let the experts sort it out. The overwhelming weight of evidence from the experts, so-called experts, we voted them in there. We don't really know.
Well, the people who do...
supposed to be experts in.
Yes.
But, we voted to put it back to...
But tell me why you're troubled by the suspension of Parliament. They'll be back by the middle of October. Any legislative attempts to slow down this kamikaze process could still happen. Why is this such a grave issue for you?
Because the minority of few people that think it's a good idea to keep their jobs and move forward with a no deal are going to overwhelmingly deride the efforts of the people who believe it's a bad idea and push us down that road.
I mean, I think, like me, you struggle to work out who actually thinks it's a good idea. You know that for many, many moons now, I've been pointing out that when you ask people why we have to do this stupid thing, they say because we voted for it. Yes. And they can't tell you why they voted for it, and all the things they said they voted for have turned out not to be true, except possibly the passports, which I think are going to be printed in Poland. I may have got that wrong, but it used to be funny when I sat here going, passports, fish, passports. It's not funny anymore, is it, Jack? Can you think of any positives?
No, I've been sat here scratching my head for a long time.
Can you think of any way in which, if you were on the other side of this argument, you could argue that suspending Parliament is a really good way of restoring parliamentary sovereignty?
I guess because, and I'm going to be harsh here,
yes,
because most of these people that voted leave have felt like perennial losers their whole life. They've been told that they could have had the moon on a stick if we weren't in the EU.
Yes.
And now we're leaving the EU, and they're still being told they're going to get the moon on a stick, and they're still expecting the moon on a stick. So if I was one of those people expecting the moon on a stick, I'd be wanting my moon on a stick, and if I was told I could have my moon on a stick, by the 1st of November, I'll probably still...
That's the only way you can convince them that the moon on a stick still exists, is by, of course, continuing to pursue the no detail, no deal. It's 10:41, because the minute you ask for detail, it always looks worse than remaining. And this is I oddly pretty close now to wishing they'd got the withdrawal agreement through Parliament. Despite the fact that I, like Boris Johnson, I see it as being demonstrably worse than remaining in the European Union. You don't, this is the problem, doesn't it? It doesn't matter how many people are in the car. If a lunatic has grabbed the steering wheel, you're all going to crash. So maybe just voting for putting someone, the third best driver in the building, into the driving seat rather than letting the lunatic have hold of the steering wheel would have been preferable. That's why, and I think Tom made this point earlier, people like Keir Starmer perhaps do bear responsibility for not getting the withdrawal agreement through. But how can you persuade a sovereign parliamentarian to vote for something that they know will damage the country? Answer, because they also know that it won't damage the country as much as the other thing, which is where Rory Stewart was arguing from. It's clearly a bad idea, but people want it. We have to respect them. Therefore, let's do it in the least damaging way possible. Didn't happen. I told you at the time that when Johnson and Gove went through different lobbies on the withdrawal agreement, and yet the rhetoric of leave means leave was still live, that's when reality left the building. And I don't know when it's coming back. Andy's in Welwyn Garden City. Andy, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, shall we go from... I'm 53 years of age.
Okay. I
remember a prosperous 60s and the beginning of the 70s.
Right.
Then I remember the poverty of the 70s. The demise of England in the 80s. We didn't give up. We gave back Australia, Canada, etc., the Commonwealth. We had to give that up to actually become part of Europe as we are now. And in the last 15 years, I've seen my local hospital close, St Albans Hospital close, Hertford Hospital close, and have a rebuild. Now, these rebuilds, they call them clinics.
I don't want to sound ungrateful, Andy, but just let me nudge you towards the suspension of Parliament and your reaction to that.
It's a good idea, because
yes,
if we don't come out of Europe on the 31st,
yes,
then we're going to be drained, as we have been for the last 30 years. Leaving Europe...
There's no measure that... I mean, we were the sick man of Europe in the early 70s. You're suggesting... I mean, I don't know where you sit politically, but you think that Margaret Thatcher's premiership was a disaster for the United Kingdom, do you?
Not completely, no. Because she only had a rebuild of all the money that Labour had taken out of Europe, out of the railways, out of this and out of that.
Sorry, say that again?
Labour never invested any money in the railways back in the early 70s.
Right.
Late 80s, when they were in power.
Yeah.
Late 60s, I mean. Now, when she came in, everything was always already crashing. She had to say...
I'm going to crack on. I'm very grateful for the call, but I've got Lewis Goodall on the other line, and for my money, as I've told him before, Lewis is doyen of political correspondence at the moment, and I apologise in advance for the question I'm about to ask you, Lewis. What's going on?
Oh, my word. Well, James, I mean, if I could answer that, I wouldn't be doing this. Look, this is an extraordinary moment. Boris Johnson has... There's been speculation about this. Even at the weekend, the government was saying that prorogation just wasn't going to happen. For your listeners, prorogation is a very fancy word, but basically it just means suspending Parliament. That sounds very dramatic. Normally, it isn't very dramatic, because prorogation usually just happens when a parliamentary session, which is normally about a year, comes to an end, and then there is a new parliamentary session, which is marked by a Queen's speech. Queen gets into all of her glab rags, her finest robes, and goes to open Parliament for a new session. As I say, that's not normally controversial. This session has been going on for a long time, for over 2 years. The reason for that is the government has been scared about starting a new session, because a new session, as I say, starts with a Queen's speech, which is voted upon by Parliament, and they have been worried that if they have a Queen's speech, as is typical, they might lose it. So it is a surprise to see, and if they lose it, there will be a general election, almost certainly. So it's a surprise to see one. The reason that they are doing it is to limit the amount of parliamentary time which is available to Parliament to scrutinise Brexit and to try and prevent a no-deal Brexit, because in doing this, they're shaving a week off parliamentary time in October, and then what follows after that week is going to be a week or so dominated by things related to the Queen's speech, where Parliament cannot act to try and stop a no-deal Brexit.
And well, that's a masterful analysis. Is it foolproof, or will it still, in the time available, the reduced time available, will it still be possible to for Parliament to exercise its powers, given, of course, with the caveat that this whole stupid process was supposed to be about restoring powers to Parliament?
Well, I think what Downing Street's strategy to me is now very, very clear, and they've basically published a letter that they've sent to Conservative MPs, which sort of lays this out. It's clear what they're going to do. They're going to try and survive. The only period of time that Parliament now has to really flex its muscles anyway is the first 2 weeks of September, which is obviously imminent. That is the only time where they might be able to try and concoct something they were thinking of doing, which is to seize control of the parliamentary order paper to try and find a way of forcing the government's hand over no deal. If they cannot do that, and it will be difficult to do that, if they cannot do that, clearly I think Downing Street's plan is to survive those first 2 weeks, go into the conference season. There is an EU Council on October the 17th where there has been suggestion that there may be a new deal, or at least something that they can try and pretend looks like a new deal. During that time, during the Queen's speech, you will have a Queen's speech debate. They will survive that Queen's speech, because if they don't survive the Queen's speech, what they will say is no alternative government can be formed. We will sit in Downing Street to prevent an alternative government from being formed, and that will take us over October the 31st, because there will be a 5-day period after the Queen's speech itself where it will be debated and before any votes are taken. If they can survive that Queen's speech, it seems to me it is likely what they will try and do is bring this so-called no deal before Parliament in the week before October the 31st and say to a terrified Parliament, you have to vote for this deal, otherwise you're going to have a no deal Brexit. And let's be honest, Labour MPs and others who never really believed that with Theresa May, that she would actually take us into a no deal Brexit, they really do believe it with this Downing Street and Boris Johnson, because, well, he will, won't he?
And yet the ERG would vote against it.
True.
They have made clear, and sundry other interests might do as well. So it would just be Theresa May in a different outfit, right? with perhaps rather more stick than carrot.
I think so. Look, I think Downing Street, they have given up on the ERG in the sense that they know that there's always going to be a rump of ERG rebels who are not going to vote for any deal. And frankly, if that plan is correct, then we will be so close to October the 31st that they will be able to smell a no deal. It will be that tantalisingly close for them. So there will be very little incentive for them to compromise with Downing Street. Where they clearly would have more leverage than Theresa May had is, as I say, with Remainer MPs or MPs who are worried about a hard Brexit, a no-deal Brexit. Because, as I say, I think the truth is that whatever you think about Boris Johnson's strategy, he does have more credibility on the idea that he will pursue a no-deal Brexit than Theresa May ever did.
So, I mean, but this is really the do what we want or we'll blow our own brains out argument. And if I've understood you correctly, you're suggesting that people find it easier to believe that Boris Johnson will cut off his own feet than Theresa May.
Yeah, basically,
okay.
Because
Good.
I think
just checking.
Theresa May, was many things, but she was wedded. She was more of an institutional conservative than Boris Johnson, I think, or certainly the people around him appear to be. I mean, maybe that's a terrific bluff that they've succeeded in convincing everyone, but I just don't think that Boris Johnson, possibly politically, could seek an extension
because of the rhetoric of do or die.
And he's tweets it 60 times a day.
Yes.
I think it would be just impossible for him to do that. So I think that's clearly the plan. The way that it could be stopped, I think the ball is now in Remainer MPs' courts again, and people who want to avert a no-deal Brexit. They had all come to a very happy plan yesterday where I think they all seemed very content that they thought that they could just trust legislative solutions and think that that will be able to stop it. Obviously, that time now is deeply, deeply constricted. And so I think this idea of a motion of no confidence in the first 2 weeks of September will rear its head again, because, frankly, it's potentially the only way. I mean, I think...
Sorry to interrupt you. I could listen to you all day, Lewis. You know that.
Well.
But do you think today is a reaction to yesterday? Or would it have happened anyway?
No, I suspect that they have been planning this for a while. I think, the funny thing about this is that it's perfectly calibrated. Yes. Because I think that had they prorogued till after October the 31st, that would have provoked such an outrage. It would have put the Queen in such a difficult position. It would have, I think, no exaggeration, say there would have been people on the streets. And
it would be a suspension of our democracy.
A suspension of Parliament that would be unprecedented in the modern age. This is just long enough to help them achieve their ends. whilst they can still say that, look, we needed a new session, we want new legislation and so on, they can just about sell it, I think. So it's perfectly calibrated, and it's a pretty cunning, if not edifying, political move.
Cunning, if not edifying. Lewis Goodall, many thanks indeed. You can follow Lewis and his sterling work, of course, over on Sky News. It's 10:51. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we're picking over the bones of the latest Brexit-related brouhaha. Today, we find ourselves contemplating the suspension of Parliament, which some people will claim 17.4 million people voted for as a way in which to restore the powers of Parliament. And, of course, when you ask these people why, they'll tell you stuff like Australia. What do we want? More power. When do we want it? Well, just shortly after we suspend Parliament in order to stop elected MPs doing their democratic duty. Oh, OK. Yeah, you probably should have given us a heads up on that, like 3.5 years ago, instead, of course. And this is the point at which one becomes almost embarrassed by one's country, because pick your favourite Brexit cheerleader, and I will have an archive such as this one to demonstrate to you that any claims that the country voted for a kamikaze, no detail, no deal Brexit are bogus.
We'll find ourselves part of the European Economic Area and with a free trade deal. I want us to have a simple free trade agreement with the European Union. If Norway, Iceland and Switzerland can get deals that suit them, we can do something far, far better than that. Norway chooses its own deal. We will choose our own deal. We're in a much stronger negotiating position than Norway ever has been.
So the poor little sausage is in the horns of a dilemma, which is either admit that you didn't really understand what you were talking about back then, or pretend that people who trusted and believed you actually voted for the polar opposite of what you described and offered. So if it's a choice between honesty and dishonesty, I can't imagine many people have any difficulty predicting which way that would go. Bob's in Raynham. Bob, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello there. Yeah, I thought, let joy be unconfined at last with a government with some courage that's willing to actually govern.
Right.
You know,
they can't govern if Parliament's suspended. Bob, they can't govern if Parliament's suspended. You realise that?
It doesn't need to. It will do after it comes back. It's doing that so that it can govern.
Well, it can govern now.
We've got more government now than we've had in 40 years, which is why I voted for leave, because we had a political class that had taken over the government and it wasn't governing the country.
Right.
It was too much talking and doing nothing, and letting the EU control us, and that's why many people voted to leave.
So how does suspending Parliament?
How does suspending? Well,
no, Bob, I haven't finished the question.
He's governing.
Yes. How is it enhanced government to suspend Parliament?
How is it enhanced government?
Yes.
I don't care if it's enhanced or not.
Let me use a different word. How is it increased or improved? But how, Bob?
Well, because I don't know whether he might even be able to get a new speaker. Will he be able to get rid of Burko? Because it's a new parliament.
Well, the elections for the speakers, I think, are irrespective of Queen's speeches.
Yeah, but I thought it went by session, and the only reason that he's still there is because
he gets elected, so you'd still have to have a vote, and they're not changing the personnel of Parliament. But let's go back to why this increases government. How does it improve or let Boris Johnson do more governing?
Well, it allows him and his party to govern rather than constantly going.
But how? But what's the difference between?
We've seen them.
But what's the difference between what they can do today and what they'll be able to do after the next Queen's speech in the middle of October?
The difference between what they can do now and between then is, well, hopefully that because he's demonstrating that he's got the courage to run a country, that he's going to be able to do.
He can't pass any laws without
he will
Parliament.
do afterwards. I mean, OK, what's 2 weeks? We've had 10 years of austerity, for God's sake, so what's 2 weeks?
But what in a sentence, what point do you think you're making?
Well, I'm making the point that we at last have a government rather than a parliament.
But he's suspending Parliament. There is
you need a government to govern, not to sit there talking for years.
But how can he govern if there's no Parliament?
Because he will come back, and then the government.
But when he comes back, then we'll have Parliament again. But we've got Parliament
and govern the country. Because I'd imagine that because of what he's done, he will win the next election.
Because he's suspended Parliament, he'll win the next election.
Because he's demonstrated courage.
Right. So it takes guts to suspend Parliament.
It takes guts to govern.
Right. But he can't govern if Parliament is suspended. You do understand that bit?
I do.
Right.
It doesn't
so
matter.
you're delighted that he's suspended Parliament.
He's been away on bloody 6 weeks holiday.
Yes,
what's the difference between that?
But then why? Okay, let me rephrase. Let me try again. Yes, I know. For goodness sake.
It can't be much of a.
No.
It can't be much.
So why do you think he's suspended Parliament then? Why do you think he's done it, Bob?
Well, because it demonstrates the fact that he's serious about what he wants to do.
What does that mean, Bob?
What does it mean? It means that
it demonstrates. Let me just repeat your words back to you.
Come out of the EU.
But suspending Parliament doesn't really demonstrate what you've just described.
Well, it does. It shows that he has the courage to take this country forward and at last get some real government.
Yeah, but again, I don't. At this point, you keep making about. So real government is a government without Parliament, is it? I don't quite understand what you think you're saying.
It's not a government without Parliament, but we don't elect a Parliament. We elect a government to govern.
No, we elect a Parliament, mate, and whoever gets the majority in the Parliament earns the right to govern.
Yes, and once they're in, they govern. But for the last 20 years...
But then if they suspend Parliament, they don't govern.
Stop them governing.
Right.
There's been no government for 30 years since Thatcher.
There's been no government for 30 years since Thatcher?
No, there's just been a weak, wishy-washy people who have done nothing, who've let the EU make their laws, their rubber stamp.
Okay, just before you go, Bob, you know what I say now, don't you?
Go on.
Which of those dreadful laws are you most looking forward not to have to obey anymore?
Oh, they've stopped us from tramping the grapes. We can't do that, and we have to use machinery now. How about that?
Yeah, that's great, Bob. Well done.
Good for you, Pie.
Yeah. 11:02. I'm receiving reports that if you were minded to tramp your own grapes by foot rather than by machine, there is currently nothing to prevent you from doing so, but fair play to Bob. That is the glorious future which he envisaged when he voted to leave, a future in which I don't think he is a winemaker, but he's profoundly exercised by his belief that winemakers are prevented from crushing grapes with their feet. 6 minutes after 11, probably, I'm not even going to check today, but probably lots of people are now being rude about the callers in the last hour who suggested that this was all great news because of us giving Australia up in the 1980s, or because Labour failed to invest in the railways in the 1970s, or because British winemakers are not allowed to use their feet to crush grapes. But these are your people, so don't be rude to them or indeed about them. It actually offends me, oddly, despite the fact that I find their ignorance heartbreaking. They're on the same side as you. They've got the guts to ring in, despite knowing that probably things won't go great for them. At least they've got the guts to do it, rather than to sit on the sidelines claiming that people are specially selected for being stupid, or I used to see claims that people weren't real. They'd ring in. This is what happens when you hold up mirrors and people hate what they see in the mirror. They claim that the mirror is defective. No defective mirrors here. No defective mirrors here. What you see is what you are, and what you are is on precisely the same side of history as people who think that suspending Parliament is a good idea because you're not allowed to crush grapes with your own feet, or because we were somehow forced into surrendering Australia in the 1980s. Your team, your people, your reflection. Don't blame me. 7 minutes after 11, and on we go. Johnny is in Sydney, Australia, appropriately enough. I hope you're enjoying your freedom that was delivered as a direct result of our joining the European Union. You might not be familiar with that chapter of Australia's history, but we will park that for the moment, Johnny, and ask, what do you think's happening? What do you think's going on?
Thank you for the lesson, James. I always knew we'd speak at some point, although I'm deeply dismayed that today's turn of events has been that very reason. I feel that this is deeply, deeply wrong. I said to your researcher that I did not actually vote. I lived in Australia at the time of the referendum. I didn't vote because I was so on the fence. However, the reason that I didn't was, in full honesty, because if someone had put a gun to my head, I would have actually voted to leave.
Yes.
Since then, my opinion changed fundamentally. I felt that I was sold an absolute pack of lies. However, if at any point since there had been a credible version via which we could leave, then I would have been perfectly happy with that.
What do you mean by credible?
Happy.
What do you mean by credible?
Well, I mean something that would see an economic uptick in terms of the United Kingdom. I live in Australia,
I don't think there's any analysis that would deliver or predict that. An actual improvement.
No, I agree with you.
Right.
Of course, yes, I agree with you. I mean, but if at any point since the referendum something along those lines of the
tangible benefits, this voice in the wilderness, this voice, what are the tangible benefits? What do you think you've won? What are you most looking forward to? I don't have to answer these questions, you condescending, sneering Ramona. Leave means leave. Well, tell us why it's a good thing. Certainly not. How dare you question me like that, you condescending, sneering Ramona. What you're saying is put some flesh on the bones and I'll go with you.
James, there are none. That has been made.
How dare you? Have you tried believing harder?
There are none.
Have you tried believing harder?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I have a big glass of optimism every single morning, but clearly that isn't.
Are you not aware that the German car industry is going to come galloping to our rescue any minute now?
Well, I can't hear them. I mean, I've gotten them
electric cars
far away from where you are. Other electric cars, okay, so maybe the sound doesn't travel quite as far. Look, I think I remain one of those people where, although I didn't vote, I kind of feel lost in the middle, where even subsequent to the referendum, if any tangible benefits had really been provided, then I would have really gone along with that, and I think I would have been quite happy to have said, okay, that was the, deep breath.
I didn't vote leave.
But it just never happened, James, did it?
No, and I'm the same as you. I thought I would have had to shut up by now. I genuinely did. I also, for what it's worth, I thought my book would have been horribly out of date by now, rather than I've just learned the #1 best-selling non-fiction book on the whole of Amazon last week.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I genuinely thought, because you just presumed, didn't you? This is why I used to use the analogy of the flesh-coloured body stocking. You sit here, you voted for the Emperor's new clothes. I didn't vote for the Emperor's new clothes, but I didn't know for sure that the Emperor was naked, and I've spent 2 years thinking, well, maybe there is a flesh-coloured body, but now you're in a place where they just scream at you and they claim that the best thing about what they've done is the fact that people like me are unhappy about it, or people like you who voted for it have now seen the error of your ways, and they drink your salty tears.
I didn't vote.
No, you didn't vote at all, but you would have done.
Yes. But if you put a gun to my head, I would have voted to leave, but that changed very, very quickly thereafter due to the turn of events. And I mean, look, I live in Australia, but I do have financial interests in the UK, and I am speaking on behalf of a lot of expats in Australia as a whole who are in a very similar scenario. People are literally waiting to pull money out. That is what they are doing. Like the amount of money that will be pulled out of UK bank accounts by expats in the coming weeks, well, I thought perhaps even the coming days, will be really quite astronomical. So I forecast quite a significant economic risk in terms of the amount of capital flight, in terms of savings and investments, because people just have now lost all confidence. It seemed until the last few days, even until 24 hours ago, that there was still going to be a chance, given Jeremy Corbyn, Joe Swinson, etc., everyone coming together, that there was a little glimmer of hope. But James, even I detected, perhaps in the tone of your voice this evening, I detected, I'm a long-time listener of the show.
Yeah, I also, for people just tuning in, John is in Australia. He's not lost complete touch with the time-space vortex.
Oh, I listened to James.
No, you just said this evening.
Everything's in reverse.
Things are confusing enough. Things are confusing enough for my listeners. Yes, exactly that. But no, I'm not. I don't know. Today, I feel embarrassed today because of what I do for a living and because of the warped way in which my brain works. I get quite excited by how fascinating it all is. When I finish work today, I'll join you in dismay and probably mild depression.
Of course, and look, James, it's become a bit of a sort of morbid soap opera, and I wish I didn't have any interest in the next episode, but unfortunately I do. Yeah. And a lot of people, whether yourself in the United Kingdom or me in Australia, really, really do. So we're all kind of waiting with bated breath with regards to what's.
And we're all hoping against hope that you know, things aren't quite as bad. I mean, I don't personally believe that the worst case scenarios are going to come to pass, but I do know for a fact that if you have a queue outside Dover that's 25 lorries long rather than 2,500 lorries long, these shysters, these charlatans, these absolute clowns will start claiming that as some sort of victory. We've already forgotten. We've already, apart from here, we've already stopped asking what's actually going to be better. I was on holiday last week. I saw Liz Truss boasting about a trade deal with South Korea. Do you remember when that lady rang us from Lowestoft, saying that we'll be fine when we leave, we'll be able to do trade with people like South Korea? And just after she'd hung up, someone rang in to say the EU has a trade agreement with South Korea. That's why a big boat full of cockles is setting sail this morning from Lowestoft to South Korea. And you sort of think, well, if people right there at the coast don't even understand the simplest of principles with regard to their own industry and their own hometown, let alone their own politics, what chance is there for people like Bob in Raynham, or indeed anybody else claiming today that 17.4 million people voted to restore parliamentary power by suspending Parliament? It's 11:15. As we contemplate Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament in order to prevent parliamentarians from questioning and potentially stopping the no deal, no detail kamikaze Brexit for which precisely nobody voted. Let's hear again from, let's hear for the first time from some of those key campaigners for leaving the European Union and how they feel about the idea that Michael Gove would be a good one. He was the leader, of course, of the Vote Leave campaign, and clearly he was one of the many people who persuaded those 17.4 million people to vote for no deal. Let's just cross to Michael now.
It's a grim but inescapable fact that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, the effective tariffs on beef and sheep meat would be above 40%. In some cases, well above that. The costs imposed by new tariffs would undoubtedly exceed any adjustment in the currency markets. And of course, if the pound does make exports more competitive, it also feeds inflationary pressures at home. The combination of significant tariffs when none exist now, friction and checks at the border when none exist now, and requirements to reroute or pay more for transport when current arrangements are frictionless will all add to costs for producers.
Oh, sorry, I misread my notes. Anyway, I'm sure Mr Farage had lots of things to say in favour of no deal before. I think that would go speaking after the referendum. I'm sure Mr Farage had lots of things to say about no deal, which he's, of course, claiming 17.4 million people voted for, and which his new project, the Brexit Party Limited, has somehow managed to claim responsibility for. I'm being unfair to the fellow. I remember him. He talked about no deal all the time. He was always saying that was on the table. He never suggested for a minute that people voting because they trusted him were voting for a deal.
We'll find ourselves part of the European Economic Area and with a free trade deal. I want us to have a simple free trade agreement with the European Union. If Norway, Iceland and Switzerland can get deals that suit them, we can do something far, far better than that. Norway chooses its own deal. We will choose our own deal. We're in a much stronger negotiating position than Norway ever has been.
Callum's in Glasgow. Callum, what would you like to say?
Well, I'd like to say that it's essential to remember that suspending Parliament is within our Constitution and happens regularly. John Major did it to pass Maastricht, Clement Attlee did it in the 40s, but in this particular case, I think it is an abuse of power by the government.
What's the difference? Sorry, I've interrupted you. Go on.
I was just saying that I think that it's the way that the government is pitching it this time is to get through something in those parliaments will not support, whereas in previous periods when Parliament was prorogued, it was to pass legislation which the government itself didn't support. So Maastricht wasn't supported by the Conservatives, so they prorogued Parliament and got it through on Labour votes.
But that's why I don't see what the difference is. So the government wanted it, but the parliamentary.
I would say that it's an abuse of power by government to prorogue Parliament in this way, and it's happened before. But I would say in a specific case, because of the environment that we're in, it would do even more damage than usual, and would set a dangerous precedent in the future.
And of course, what you remind us of course, is that the Eurosceptic lobby would have presumably, and I think it fell under the auspices of my A-level. I just know it happened just after my A-level in politics, so I haven't got the facts at my fingertips as well as you have. But presumably, Eurosceptics were absolutely outraged about Major's finagling, if you want to describe it such, to get Maastricht through. But now
I would imagine that they were.
Which puts them in the very, for them, familiar position today of arguing passionately that two wrongs actually do make a right.
Well, the thing about Brexit is I think it is just, in general, a power grab by the government and Parliament in general. And one of the main reasons why we would leave the European Union is what one of the previous callers suggested, that the government would have more power. We'd have more government in the country.
Yes. That was an odd. That was an odd intervention.
Assuming more power is sometimes dangerous.
Well, it is a very odd thing to what do we want? More unaccountable power, suspend Parliament and give more power to a politician with an incredibly flimsy majority and arguably no mandate at all. I don't ask this question facetiously, but should we calm down a bit? I mean, but Boris Johnson, some of the parallels drawn with the Reichstag fire I've seen on social media this morning, and of course, we look across the Atlantic and we see a leader there who has completely subverted all the norms of conventional decency and democracy. We're not there, are we?
We're not there, but we're certainly not in a good place. And I would say that any progressive in Britain that wanted to improve the situation will find it more difficult as things develop. And I think every precedent being set by this government is making it harder to develop positive change.
And what is scary about it, and where echoes, even very, very ugly echoes perhaps, are relevant, is this curious, for those of us on the outside of the madness, this idea that you are persuaded that you've lost your democracy, and that is a process by which you somehow end up enthusiastically supporting an erosion of your democracy.
Well, Britain is not and has never been a democracy. It's been a constitutional monarchy, which happens to have one of its chambers of parliament be elected. And even then, the electoral system is hardly democratic.
Well, yes, we've gone down a slightly unexpected avenue there. It's a debate I shall have with you on another occasion, an interesting one. But it is, for my money, yet more evidence of that really weird process, which we called out a couple of years ago for the first time, which is that this is turning us into potentially exactly what they told us we were. You have to leave the European Union because XYZ, Parliament's got no power or whatever. And then you become precisely that, which is very, very weird. And any sort of trade agreement will arguably involve the same surrender of sovereignty, because you'll have to abide by mutually agreed rules, but we won't have, as a tiny participant in that negotiating process, 60 million versus 500 million customers, we won't have anywhere near as much say in what those rules would be. 25 minutes after 11, and again, I sound a little plaintive perhaps when I say what are the positives. I don't want to go home today with the words of Bob and his grapes echoing in my ear, or the claims about Australia and Labour Party investment in the railways, or the idea that somehow this gives Boris Johnson more ability to govern than he currently has. I don't want any of those. I want to know the positives. 0345 60609 73. Namrata is in Clapham. Namrata, what would you like to say?
James, I was calling in to make a comparison to Donald Trump, and I think you just alluded to that.
Yeah.
And you said, is it as bad yet? Are we there yet? I follow U.S. politics a lot more closely than I probably should. My husband happens to be American. And I want to make the point that it goes down a slippery slope very quickly. And if you look at the damage that Donald Trump has done to the democracy in the U.S.,
but people like it. This is
rhetoric.
I hear you.
Well,
people do like it.
Do people really like it? I mean, I don't want to go into the electoral college versus.
No, but enough people like it. So this is. Forgive me. This is where I get.
Agree with you.
This is where I get frustrated.
Electoral college versus. Firstly, there are two things. Firstly, there was the electoral college versus popular vote.
No, I know all that. I know all that.
And all of that.
Yeah. Okay.
Secondly, the election, the midterm election showed that he doesn't have as much popular support. My point is if Boris Johnson thinks enough people like this kind of disdain for checks and balances, disdain for truth, disdain for explaining to people and not reneging on false promises you've made, then go get the majority in Parliament, go have another referendum. The reason they're scared of using these two tools is because they know that enough people don't like it anymore now that a lot of things have...
Yes, but you don't...
That,
again, that's where the Trump parallel's at its most powerful, actually. Because it doesn't matter that almost all viable arithmetic points out that support for a no-deal Brexit is relatively tiny in the context of not just polling, but, of course, what was explained and what was voted for at the time. But you can't deal logically with people who are saying, I voted to leave because I believed the Remain side. You've had senior government politicians saying 17.4 million people voted to leave, and they knew exactly what they were voting for because the people we called liars told them to. You know, you can just stick your hand out the window. You can catch 10 people flying past who still think that there's some mileage in that. That, for me, is the most fundamental deception of the last few weeks. The claim, they knew they were voting for a no-deal Brexit. They knew they were voting for WTO terms. They knew we were going to have to leave the single market and the customs union. And you hear those tapes of Farage that I've just played you saying the precise opposite. Now, he's an extreme example. He'll argue that it's not raining, even as he comes close to drowning under the weight of raindrops falling on his head. But all of the others are edging towards that level of duplicity. Now, there he is, on tape, explaining all the various deals that we would get, not that we could get, that we categorically would get. Digby Pudding-Jones saying, I know what the German car industry will do. But I don't even have to scratch the surface to find someone who will claim that 17.4 million people voted for no deal, despite the fact that nobody on the Leave side of the referendum campaign offered that up as a possibility. Quite incredible. But, as I've said to you millions of times, it's a Dostoevsky quote. It's when people have started lying to themselves, you see. You can lie to me. I can see that it's a lie. You can persuade yourself that it isn't. And you can get very, very cross with anybody who holds up a mirror or asks you to explain your logic. But when you're lying to yourself, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do. You will now hear a politician claiming that you voted to leave the European Union because the people they called liars were telling the truth and you secretly knew this all along. That's the contempt in which they hold you. So this is the Dominic Cummings school of thought. Treat these people like mushrooms. Leave them in the dark and occasionally cover them in manure. And they will thank you for it and their support for you will grow. So now British politics is reduced to suspending Parliament in order to somehow restore the power of Parliament and to deliver the, quotes, will of the people, where those people are the ones who apparently believed the other side while you were calling them liars. It's dignity that's dead, you know. Possibly democracy next. I'm not sure, the earlier caller, and you'll forgive me for not having this stuff at my fingertips. I hope you will anyway. I don't think he did prorogue Parliament to get Maastricht through. I could be wrong about that. I think, wasn't it more to do with sort of hanging on with a very, very flimsy majority until he could call an election, and that involved the suspension of Parliament? I don't know, but I shall look into it. You could, yeah, because it was 97 when he did that, and Maastricht was 92. I think our caller may have got that slightly confused, but it doesn't matter. Of course, the question today is how we feel about Boris Johnson suspending democracy to deliver the will of people who apparently voted to leave the European Union because they knew that the other side were telling the truth and that their own side, who called the other side liars, were actually lying when they called the liars liars. Are you still with me at the back? 11:35. One man who has followed every twist and turn of this remarkable, this labyrinthine saga with, I sense, an increasingly sort of incredulous attitude is the Times columnist and the former Tory MP Matthew Parris, who joins me on the line now. Matthew, what do you make of this morning's developments?
It's outrageous. It comes quite close to being constitutionally unacceptable, but it is probably just about okay. constitutionally, the Prime Minister can ask the Queen to suspend Parliament. It's just that he's doing it at a time when he doesn't need to do it. There was no reason why MPs shouldn't have 2 or 3 weeks before the party conference season and then suspend for the party conference season. He's doing it early for a very simple reason. It is to cramp the time in which the rebels who want to stop a no-deal Brexit can get through the necessary legislation. They now probably have only 7 or 8 days to do it, and it's not clear that they can.
And to people who would argue that this is what the country wanted, and I've had a couple of callers today persuaded that this is something they should be celebrating. They're not entirely sure why, but you know as well as I do that for the last few years the detail hasn't really mattered. They cheer a slogan, an idea, and the no-deal Brexit is the latest thing that they've been persuaded that they secretly wanted all along. So they get what they want, and that is democratic in some sense.
Well, if we're to have government by how people are feeling today,
yes,
and what mood is sweeping the nation this week, then yes, that is democratic. We have, for the last many hundreds of years, had a parliament with elected representatives, and we have exercised our democracy generally through electing the representatives. We have occasionally had referendums, but it's never been suggested that the Parliament itself should simply be stopped from making decisions of enormous importance to the country. You're quite right. It depends how you define democracy. We could do it by internet, and we'd have a hanging back, I expect, before the end of the week.
Indeed we would, and I think the crossovers are pertinent on that one as well. So I sense from your tone, I mean, they've gone as close as they can to some sort of constitutional offence, but they haven't, largely because of the timing. And this makes the prospect of that no deal, kamikaze Brexit that bit more likely.
Yes, I think that's right, and I don't think even people as outraged as Dominic Grieve or any of us on the Remain side can claim that the Queen has any discretion in this.
No,
when the Prime Minister asks to suspend Parliament for a Queen's speech, the Queen has to agree to it. That it just might backfire for Boris Johnson. There will be such anger, not just amongst Remainers, but amongst those who want a deal but don't want a no deal. There will be such anger at this that it is even possible that you could get a no confidence motion through the House of Commons in the essentially week or 8 days that they now have left. It is also possible that Dominic Grieve, who's trying to organise a way that MPs can take control of Parliament and take control of the government's legislative programme and block no deal that way, he might just be able to do it in 7 or 8 days. It's not clear. But if it becomes clear that he can't, you might just now scrape through a majority for a no confidence vote in the government. You wouldn't have been able to yesterday.
I see, but I think Johnson could still sit tight, couldn't he? And in that event, if nobody else could demonstrate an ability to form a majority government, I don't know why I've got the figure of 5 days buzzing away in the back of my brain for some reason.
It's 14 days.
Is it?
After no confidence, he has 14 days, or rather, the opposition have 14 days to come up with somebody who does command a majority. So he is not necessarily doomed by losing a vote of confidence, but once that had been lost, I would have thought that all the opposition parties and the rebel Tories would get together to try to find some interim leader and put that person forward as someone who could gain the confidence of the House.
If you had a time machine, Matthew Parrish, would you hop in it and urge Labour MPs and others to support Theresa May's withdrawal agreement?
That is a really difficult question, James. A question to which I would always have said no until now.
Not for the first time.
Theresa May's deal is better than no deal. I've always thought no deal could be avoided, in which case I'd go for Remain. But if no deal if it is a choice between Theresa May's deal and no deal, then I think I would probably now go for Theresa May's deal.
Not for the first time, Matthew Parris. I think we're on similar pages, but of course the likelihood of no deal for me increases every time people are asked to acknowledge the fact that there is nothing better than remaining. I don't think anybody fully expected it to go all the way to the wire, and people will still be queuing up to claim that this is somehow what they want. Matthew Parris, Times columnist, and I think relevantly a former Conservative MP, former deputy leader of the Conservative Party, speaking in even more outraged and disgusted terms to Tom Swarbrick on the breakfast programme earlier today. Lord Heseltine, of course. This phrase, constitutional crisis, pertinent, valid, probably accurate, but of course it doesn't matter because plenty of people still labour under the illusion that somehow this is what they want. Problems come when you ask them why. Danny is in Eastbourne. Danny, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi there, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
I just wanted to say that I'm a young voter. I'm 24, so I was 21 when I voted in the referendum. I voted to leave. I still want to leave, and I did have no deal in mind when I voted in 2016.
Okay, why?
Well, because Brexit, as I saw it, or voting to leave, was a shot in the dark. And I think everyone who voted to leave was aware that it could go one of many ways, and that would include...
But which way were you hoping for?
No deal.
Why?
Because I don't like the EU. I find it to be an illegitimate institution.
Why?
Because it's big government, which I can't fully participate in.
So what do you mean by that, Danny?
Well, I don't see why I should share a government with 27 other countries, basically.
What sort of areas of government are you thinking of when you say that?
Well, I mean, let's say Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. I never voted for them, but they have...
No, they're people. What areas of policy are you thinking about when you talk about sharing?
I don't know, but that's not the point. The point is...
Mate, that is the only point, Danny. You voted to prevent, or you voted because you object to something. I'm asking you to describe the thing that you object to, my friend.
The EU.
Yes. Why?
Because it's a big overarching government that controls all of Europe. And I don't like it.
Point to the areas.
To be more effective.
Point to the areas of control that you object to.
The EU.
Yes. What do they control that you object to?
28 countries.
Yes, the areas of policy, the things you can and can't do in your daily life or even on a national level that the EU control. What are the things you object to?
That's not really the point. The point,
Danny, that's the only point. You voted because you object to something. I'm asking you to describe what it is. So the things that you feel they control, what are they?
I object to EU controlling the countries. And I don't know what you want me to say, James.
Just give me something that they control that you really don't like.
28 countries.
Yes. What is it they control that you don't like? Because I've been to 4 or 5 of those countries in the last 3 weeks, and I can tell you now that they've all got a whole host of very, very different laws. You could hop on the train now to Scotland and be obeying very different laws from the laws you have to obey in Eastbourne. So the areas in which the European Union, with its, to quote you, back at yourself, with its big government and its control of 28 countries, what are the things that you believe they control that you object to?
I don't know, to be honest with you, James.
Do you think you should have known before you decided that it was true?
No, because I disagree with it on principle.
Yes, what's the principle?
The principle is that it's a giant overarching government that controls 28 countries.
So what does it... So we're back again, Danny, mate. So what does it control?
28 countries.
Yes, but how can it control 28 countries if Scotland and England have different laws?
Because it writes legislation for those countries.
It writes legislation for Scotland and England that's different?
No.
What do you mean then by those words?
28 countries.
Say again?
It writes legislation for 28 different countries.
And what is the legislation that you're thinking of now?
Well, for example, the first thing that comes to mind, you know when you go on a website now and it tells you about cookies?
Yes.
That comes from the EU.
Right. And that's your evidence of overarching control?
Well, I don't see why I should be told about... I understand what cookies are.
What are they?
See why I should have those annoying pop-ups.
What are they?
What are cookies?
Yeah.
They remember your personal data when you go onto a website.
And you don't think people should be asked whether or not they want their personal data to be recorded.
I don't really think it's the point, James. I don't see
it's
why
your point. It's your example of why you think the overarching government of 28 countries...
I don't see why the EU has any business in controlling something like that.
Right.
They're supposed to be about trade, from what I understand. Free trade between countries, not...
Yes, but we're leaving that.
The internet.
No deal means we leave the free trade.
Yeah, and
that's what you wanted.
Yeah.
Well, you can't have it both ways, can you?
What do you mean?
Well, you can't say it's supposed to be about free trade, but I now want no free trade.
That's not the point. The point is
you keep saying that's not the point. What is the point, Danny? Apart from cookies, what is this thing that you feel oppressed by?
It's not that I feel oppressed by the EU in general.
Yes, I know you do, but I'm looking for the reason.
Well, it doesn't
That's why I
matter.
say, what is it that you feel oppressed? Well, of course it is, because you could feel oppressed by dragons, but they don't exist, you see. So what is the thing that exists? Yes, of course you can, as soon as you've answered my question. What is the thing that exists that best illustrates your belief that this institution in Brussels has too much control over the laws in this country? What is your best case scenario, your best bit of evidence?
Okay, I've got an article in front of me from the Telegraph.
Yes.
Britain's EU contribution rises by 20% in year as UK's booming economy props up Brussels' budget.
Yes. What year was that?
That was the year up to March 2019, when we should have left.
Right. Britain's booming economy. And that's control of our laws, is it?
That's not the point. The point is why...
Well, I don't know, Danny, what the point is, mate, because you keep saying that's not the point. They control our laws. I keep saying what laws, and you keep saying cookies.
Well, I don't keep saying... Let me tell you.
Yes, I'm listening.
Why should Britain be required to prop up Brussels' economy after voting to leave?
What do you mean by the Brussels economy?
Well, that's what this Telegraph article says.
Well, what does it mean? Does it mean the urban economy of the city of Brussels, or does it mean the contributions we make to the European Union in return for full access to the single market and various other institutions?
Well, I don't want full access to the single market.
But you said the whole point of the European Union was free trade. All right, mate, I wish you well. I really do wish you well, actually, Danny. I really do. And take care. Dear James, how are you not clinically depressed having to engage with no-deal Brexiters who want to crash out because of internet cookies and grape crushing? I'm on the brink just listening to it. I'll answer that, Macca, after we hear from Anna Soubry, the MP for Broxtowe and leader of the Independent Group for Change. That's it, isn't it, Anna? The game's up. It's all over.
Oh, God. You couldn't make this stuff up, could you? But as you know, this is serious stuff. It's not a game. I'm afraid I think Boris Johnson and his unelected advisors think it is some game. This is the biggest crisis, the biggest decision our country's made since the Second World War. So what does he go and do? He shuts down Parliament just when Parliament must be sitting. And he's done it quite deliberately because he knows that the opposition parties and Conservatives, senior Conservative MPs who voted for Theresa May's deal, so they're not Remainers, they're Brexiteers, but are all as one in believing that we must stop our country crashing out without a deal. And so he thinks he's been terribly clever by proroguing Parliament and embarrassing our Queen. It's quite disgraceful, it's unprecedented, and we must stop it.
But can you?
I think there are things that we can do. Some of them I'm not even going to discuss with you and your many, many listeners. But I think the old adage of where there's a will, there's a way. And I think when you bring together, I've seen a tweet from Philip Hammond, when you bring together people of his stature, frankly, and people like, Hilary Benn, Dame Margaret Beckett, people of, I think, substance who command cross-party support in the House of Commons and in the country, experienced, decent politicians who are absolutely determined this won't happen, then that's a considerable force. And I also believe the majority of the British people, because I know everybody's fed up with Brexit. Of course they are. And they want it resolved in some way. Crashing out without a deal is not the way to do it. It's not what people were promised. And Boris Johnson has no mandate for it.
That doesn't matter, though, does it? There's two things you're missing.
What?
The first is, and even today with Boris Johnson claiming that he's doing this in order to accelerate his government's legislative agenda, people...
Which is a fib.
Well, of course it is, but people like being lied to. This is something that perhaps many politicians and people in my profession have criminally underestimated on both sides of the Atlantic in the last 3 or 4 years. They enjoy being lied to if it allows them to suspend reality or feel that their own prejudices are being endorsed. And the second problem here is that Boris Johnson's priorities are pretty clear. They always have been. He's in it for Boris Johnson, and this serves his purpose well.
Absolutely right. He wants to be the man that delivers Brexit. The fact that on his own government's papers, which have been put together by civil servants who are completely independent, public-spirited and independent, much abused by everyone involved in politics. But even the fact that those Yellowhammer papers, which detailed it, the documents that I got disclosed back in March, I think it was, and the impact assessments, which we finally got disclosed last
Project
year.
Fear, Project Fear.
But these are things that were hidden from the public deliberately. And I think my very genuine fear is that it will be 5, maybe even shorter, but 5-10 years' time. It'll be our children, actually, who will demand that public inquiry, who will see the terrible con that has been played on the British public. And they will rightly condemn those people who stood by and did nothing, especially those that actually knew the truth and still chose to do nothing. And there were too many of those in government, and there were too many of those in Parliament.
Would you name a few?
Tory.
Go on, name a few.
Well, I have called out my friend. She's been a good friend of mine, Nicky Morgan, the MP for Loughborough, who showed great courage just after the referendum and standing up and making sure that any deal came into Parliament, and now sits in government only a few months after saying on BBC Question Time that it would be mad for Parliament to be suspended and she wouldn't support a WTO, which is a no-deal Brexit. And there she is sitting in Cabinet saying, well, we're not going to suspend Parliament, we're not going to crash out without a deal.
Can you speculate on her thought processes?
Where's Amber today?
Amber Rudd as well. Can you speculate on their thought processes or their motivations? You know them better than we do.
Well, you know what? What conclusion? I don't know.
No.
I mean, maybe they're playing some cunning game, except it's not a game, is it? And what worries and troubles me more than anything is that people are looking to their own self-interest, and we know Boris does that all the time. He has a long-standing history of it, but they're looking to their own futures, and they're not looking to the future of their children and their grandchildren. Because that is your duty as a member of Parliament. Your first duty to your country, and then your constituents. Certainly not yourself, and certainly not your party. And it makes you wonder, frankly, about the quality of politicians, and that's over in America and in our own country, where I'm afraid people are lauded even when they're blatant liars.
And that is
shocking. What a shoddy state of affairs we have.
I think, again, you lead us back to this thing that the likes of you and I have not yet found a solution to, which is people actively like being lied to. And today, the new lie...
No, I don't. I think what they... Look, in the past, you voted for people on the basis they were largely pretty decent, but you subscribed to their values and their principles, and then you let them get on with it, and then you looked at politics out of the corner of your eye, and if they made a mess up, you knew that in 5 years' time you could boot them out and get another lot in. And the whole thing about Brexit is that for the first time, and it's not fair on the British public, you can't rely on that way of doing things. And what you are asking people to do is become overnight experts in things like the single market and the customs union, to know the finer details of the WTO arrangements, for God's sake. And understandably, people go, well, I don't know about these things. That's your job. And yet, what we have had, which has subscribed to all of this and fueled all of this, are some very deep and dark forces that want us out of the European Union for their own purposes. And that is a different way of doing trade and business, a different sort of country, which is not the British way, turning our backs on the European Union and looking across the ocean to America, and not because they want to sell pork pies to America, for God's sakes, but because they want to sell off our NHS. And they want to deregulate us and turn us into the sort of country that we have historically not been, and is not in our best interests.
Anna Soubry, strong words. Many thanks. Interesting times. And as I suggested to you yesterday, it's taken quite a lot of evidence to understand precisely why the Chinese use that as a curse. May you live in interesting times. I used to think it was a cheery greeting. It is now approaching 12 noon. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I should acknowledge a few people getting in touch via social media who are convinced that this is fantastic news. They're not quite sure why, but the fact that people like Anna Soubry and Michael Heseltine and Matthew Parris and John Major, I suppose, and myself, much smaller status contributor to the national pageant than the aforementioned. Apparently, the fact that they're unhappy about it is the reason why you would be happy. And it probably constitutes quite a fitting moment to explain why I'm unhappy. I think that poor people are going to get poorer. I think that workers are going to lose protections. I think that some fairly malevolent forces who will never, ever be rich enough are going to be able to shape legislation in a way that renders them even richer at the expense of ordinary people. I consider myself an ordinary person. So yes, I am very sad and very worried about what's going to happen, because I think it's going to hurt you. So quite why that gives you joy, I'm not sure I'll ever understand. But just for the record, as things stand, I'm going to be fine. Delicious Remainer tears are being supped up and down the country because Boris Johnson is suspending Parliament, and people think that is great news because... and that, of course, is where things rather fall apart. Why is it great news? Well, on today's programme, we've learnt that it's great news because it increases the likelihood of us being allowed to tread grapes with our own feet again after the European Union apparently intervened and insisted upon machinery. Websites that are duty-bound to ask you whether you mind having your details recorded for various different purposes. We want to get rid of that request, down with cookies. And something about Australia that I couldn't quite get my head around. And while it's easy to mock people who have the courage to ring this programme, I have to tell you now that their cheerleaders in Parliament and elsewhere are just as ignorant on what the detail actually involves, or on why leaving is a good idea. And you can tell this because all the reasons that they gave to leave have turned out either not to be true or to be so implausible as to be close to impossible, which, as I said to you 18 months ago, will lead to a point where the only thing that keeps the Brexit bus moving is whatever tactic allows them to avoid writing down the detail. And no deal means no detail, which is why it's where Johnson has currently ended up. 6 minutes after 12 is the time. Dame Margaret Beckett is, of course, a former Foreign Secretary and the Labour MP for Derby South. I'll ask you what I've asked almost everybody today. Margaret, what do you make of this morning's developments?
Well, to be perfectly honest, when I first heard about it, I didn't believe it. I thought it was too ridiculous and too extraordinary to be true. Because let's not forget, Boris Johnson has spent, something of the order of perhaps less than 48 hours in Parliament as Prime Minister since he was elected by the Conservative Party, not by the people. Parliament is not now sitting, so behind the back of MPs, he has ruthlessly, and to my mind, unforgivably, exploited the constitutional relationship between the Prime Minister and the monarchy to bounce the Queen into agreeing to a prorogation, which means Parliament would in effect not be sitting for more than a handful of days between now and potentially our leaving the European Union. And of course, this is at a time when, you were making the point about the detail.
Yes.
He says grandly and sweepingly that, we'll have magnificent plans for no-deal Brexit, but nobody will be able to ask him about the detail of that. And I heard this morning that he was supposed to go to the liaison committee, which is the committee of all the select committee chairs, where the Prime Minister is put under more detailed pressure, this coming week. He postponed that for a week some days ago, knowing that by then, if he gets his way, Parliament won't be sitting.
Unprecedented, probably an overused word, but it fits today.
Oh, it's mind-blowing.
Let me ask you to do something, Dame Margaret, if you would. Just park, if you can, temporarily, both your conscience, your political credibility and your intellect, and pretend you're on the other side of the argument. It's a masterstroke, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we have a man who hasn't... Are you still there?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I heard a bleep. Parliament isn't sitting... He heads a government that hasn't got a majority in Parliament. There's nothing, constitutionally proper about what he's doing, but the tiny bit of power he's got, he's using with absolute ruthlessness. And I said to somebody this morning, it is reported that when he was a child, he said he wanted to be world king. All I can say is he's making a damn good start.
Dame Margaret Beckett, I don't know what we'd do if we couldn't chuckle. I dread to think. Many thanks indeed. And there it is, really. As always, it was going to be. It now comes down to... It's a bit like someone's just pointed out, and I apologise for not giving you the credit, the football arguments that we've all had in pubs where... the bloke says, my team's the best. And you say, mate, you shipped 5 goals on Saturday and you're rooted to the bottom of the league. You're 18 points adrift of safety. Yeah, but we're the best and you're rubbish. Mate, we're top of the league. We just won the FA Cup. Yeah, but we're the best and you're rubbish. And evidence doesn't matter because it's all about flags and loyalties and tribal affiliations. And, when I first started suggesting that on the programme and used that phrase footballification, because it was the only way I could make sense of what things were, what was happening. The idea that if your centre-forward gets scythed down in the box by someone who makes Norman Bites Your Legs Hunter look like Duncan Norvell, you might need a little bit of advice on those references from older relatives if you're not close to my vintage. But Norman Hunter was pretty rough. And there will be people on the defender's side claiming that it's absolutely not a foul. Don't be ridiculous. People will, to paraphrase Orwell in slightly facile circumstances, they will ignore the evidence of their own eyes and ears. And that's where we are now. So what do you want? No deal Brexit. Why do you want it? Because the alternative is to admit that I got mugged. I got bamboozled, I got fooled. And in the case of the cheerleaders, who, like Farage, were talking about all the different deals that we would, not could, the deals we would definitely get, because we're much stronger than Norway, their choice is between admitting that they got it all wrong or continuing. They can't just send me 10,000 more pounds and we will get my late uncle's millions out of Saudi Arabia or Dubai or Nigeria or wherever the latest scam is situated. Just send me 10... I know you've sent me your life savings. We're so close now. Seriously, just send me one more cheque, and Uncle Albert's millions will be in your Santander account by tea time. Finn's in County Kilkenny. Finn, what made you pick up the phone?
I'm a Northern Irish citizen, just actually in Kilkenny visiting my girlfriend. But the problem is, if a no-deal Brexit happens, I've got 2 options.
Yeah.
Move to the Republic of Ireland or give up my love life with my partner just because of a guy who has not taken into consideration one of the biggest and busiest flaws in Brexit, which is the Irish border. I grew up...
That's the worst-case scenario you describe. I mean, in the event of no deal, it's very hard to see anything better than the worst-case scenario. But and again, this is uncharted water, but the Good Friday Agreement means that you are, if you want to be, both British and Irish.
Yes.
A no-deal Brexit would make that treaty pledge impossible to sustain.
Well, basically, under the UN, I actually have no nationality because even I'm treated differently to the rest of the Great Britain. If you take out your driving licence says GB, mine says UK.
Yes.
I'm
I didn't
different.
know that. I didn't know that.
I am completely different. My driving licence is treated completely different. So any caller that has phoned in this morning says about not having powers and Europe controls everything. Try living in Northern Ireland for the last 40 years.
Or without a government, or rather without a parliament. in the last few years. That's an interesting point. You know what it's like to have a parliament suspended.
Yes.
And it generally got presented to us on this side of the Irish Sea as an undesirable scenario. We've now got people queuing up to say that's what they secretly wanted all along. What do we want? To suspend Parliament. Why? In order to restore Parliament's power. Oh, my days. How does it come to this, Finn, from your point of view, from where you are, with your very personal investment in the issue, but also your political overview, your perspective? How has it come to this? What's your answer?
It's come to the fact that, unfortunately, corporations have taken over governments. There's no governments anymore, it's corporations. At the end of the day, David Cameron, who never backed any policy that he had apart from one, which was Brexit, because he was too afraid of his own party, every issue that he brought to the table, he actually backed down on, apart from Brexit. And now charges £15,000 an hour for private dinner speaking on business, yet has left the UK completely failed.
And yet most business, with the exception of the Wetherspoons fella and the JCB man, I saw pictures of his chateau in France on social media while I was away. It's beautiful. Are, of course, in favour of Remain. 30 minutes after Finn, I hope things transpire. I hope things turn out better than you are currently fearing. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. You know the question, and it's probably too late now. I spend, with every caller that rings in, an enormous amount of time and energy trying to understand why they hold the position that they hold. And I don't enjoy it anymore. I enjoy it because I love my job and I care about people, but I don't enjoy the plus ça change element of it, the déjà vu element of it. Every single time I say, you know what I do now? I ask you what laws, and they come back with things like grape crushing and cookies, or 3-pin plugs, or bendy bananas, and you know, it's far from funny because 17.4 million people have nothing better than that. Many of them, of course, have changed their mind, but the ones that haven't, when pushed, why are you in that position? Why are you in that position? I'd love to do it the other way round. Why do you, as someone who still thinks Brexit is a good idea, why do you think so many people are so passionate? So if you're now persuading yourself, regardless of the facts, and I'm happy to leave the facts out of the thing and talk only about the feelings, your current feeling today is that you wanted no deal all along. Why do you think so many people are so passionately opposed to it? What motivates them? Because what you're given by the shysters and the charlatans and the snake oil salesmen is lies. They'll say, oh, it's because they're in George Soros's pocket, or it's because X, Y, Z. If we could somehow do this show in a Doctor Who style and subvert reality and do it the other way round, why do you think people like Michael Heseltine or Matthew Parris or Anna Soubry or Keir Starmer or various other good faith players, why do you think they are so passionately opposed to a no deal that is being sold to you by people with an extremely long track record of lying? I'm torn a little bit on that Channel 4 head of news thing that happened last week. I've called people liars a lot, but it's not necessarily healthy or helpful. You can point out a lie, but to call someone a liar is a bigger leap. You know, I could lie to you today. Would that make me a liar forevermore? I don't know. I think in Johnson's case it's slightly different, given that he has told lies at almost every stage of his personal and political life to almost everybody that's ever come into his orbit, which makes me wonder why you trust him now. 12:16. If you heard me scrambling a bit while I was talking to Finn, I was trying to find my wallet. Unless I misunderstood you, Finn, I think you got your facts a little bit wrong there. I've got my driving licence in front of me now. Good grief, I'm handsome. I've got my driving licence in front of me now, and it says UK on it, not GB. So I think everyone's driving licence says UK on it. I don't think it changes any of the central points you were making. You, for example, could go for abortion or areas in which you have to abide different laws living in Northern Ireland from what the rest of us in the United Kingdom have to abide by. There are plenty of examples, but that isn't one of them. Hang on a minute. Here's this. Oh, mate, this is it. Here you go. This is from someone called Keith Comley. Your last caller is wrong. All driving licences have UK on it, but because of your JO bias, you didn't challenge it. So even there, to my mind, Keith Comley, a completely innocuous little mistake made by Finn there in Kilkenny, which I tried to check while we were on air and have now double-checked and said, yeah, mine does say UK, doesn't say GB, so I think you got that one wrong. How can that be biased, mate? I mean, and what fight are you in that you think that there are two sides here? I've literally got my driving licence in my wallet. Even if it did say GB on it, what? I mean, this is what I mean about people so fundamentally detached from anything that remotely resembles rational behaviour. That you even think this is a cheering match. Oh, Keith Comley, mate, seriously, have a little kip or something. I think you're listening to the wrong radio programme. Listen with Mother, or something like that. I'm sure you can find it on the internet somewhere. Bias. Jeremy Corbyn has chipped in, finally. Took him a while. 11:45, roughly, I think, his contribution came. I'm appalled at the recklessness of Johnson's government, which talks about sovereignty and yet is seen to suspend Parliament to avoid scrutiny of its plans for a reckless no-deal Brexit. This is an outrage and a threat to our democracy. That is why Labour has been working across Parliament to hold this reckless government to account and prevent a disastrous no-deal which Parliament has already ruled out. If Johnson has confidence in his plans, he should put them to the people in a general election or public vote. I don't think anyone could argue with that now, could they? I mean, if this really is the will of the people, don't we need to double-check? And because people just tuning in, I've been reminding you a few occasions of how some of the seedier characters of the pro-Brexit referendum campaigns are now attempting to completely change their tune in public without having it pointed out. So Farage, almost... what did I say to you before I went on holiday? I said, how long before Farage claims that Johnson isn't Brexity enough? Didn't I? Our answer was about 3.5 weeks. The check's in the post. But here he is, explaining his absolute commitment to no deal before the referendum, because a lot of people accuse him of being dissembling or dishonest or deceitful. I think that's horribly unfair. He's none of those things. Here is Nigel Farage explaining before the referendum why he was passionately supportive of the no deal he is currently quite rightly claiming to champion.
We'll find ourselves part of the European Economic Area and with a free trade deal. I want us to have a simple free trade agreement with the European Union. If Norway, Iceland and Switzerland can get deals that suit them, we can do something far, far better than that. Norway chooses its own deal. We will choose our own deal. We're in a much stronger negotiating position than Norway ever has been.
Oh, my apologies. Again, I misread my notes. Turns out he's saying the polar opposite of what he's saying now. Who'd have thought it? Who'd have thunk it? David is in Norfolk. That's not very specific, but we shall leave it agreeably broad. What would you like to say, David?
I'm just going to start by saying that Norwich City is the best team in the world, so I just want to make sure everyone knows that.
Your team, yeah, but you lost 5-0 on Saturday, David, and you're rooted to the bottom of the league.
Yeah, still the best team in the world.
You're about to go bankrupt, mate. You're about to be chucked out of the league. You haven't scored a goal since 1963.
Yeah, still the best team.
All right, fair enough. Carry on.
So, I'm one of these people. I'm running up, I'm just tired, really. I listened to the show this morning. I've been laughing, crying, shouting at the radio.
Me too.
If you're not careful, you're going to get yourself one of these comedy awards, because the amount of hypocrisy you're highlighting here is amazing. But I think I'm going to surprise you in terms of where I'm at. I work for the NHS. I'm a Jeremy Corbyn supporter, but I also voted for Brexit.
Okay, Lexit.
So I bounce all over the place. And I think
it's a very bad phone line, and I'm very interested in what you have to say. I don't know if there's anything you can do about that.
Apologies.
That's much better. Why didn't you do that in the first place?
I just got to put my mouth slightly closer to my mouth.
Well, it's a miracle. It's a miracle. Hallelujah, I can see. Carry on, David.
So, just the hypocrisy, which is just amazing through the whole argument. I voted for basically a pitchless jigsaw when I voted. This 1,000-piece jigsaw that somehow I hope would be put right. We sent Private Pike to the negotiating table, and surprise, surprise, we didn't get what we wanted. Now, as I say, I work for the NHS, and I think I'm relatively well educated, but I'm still so confused with so many of the arguments. I think lots of my colleagues and friends I speak to, are in the same position, and I listen to people argue strongly for both sides, and you can easily highlight hypocrisy from lots of people.
Really? Do you really think so? Because, I appreciate that some of the worst forecasts that the Remain side sought to employ to spook people into voting to leave didn't come to pass. largely, or if you don't like largely, partly because of adamant Remainers like Mark Carney moving heaven and earth to make sure that their own predictions didn't come true. That's one of the things that gets overlooked by having such a slavishly pro-Brexit print media. But I don't buy the idea that it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. You sound a bit like Americans shouting, "What about her emails?" as half of Trump's campaign team is currently in jail.
When I talk about boxing, I talk about Farage, I talk about Boris, I talk about all those people.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very much. I listen to these people and I laugh at what they say. I'm not buying into any of that, James. I listen to political commentators like yourself and many other radio stations and try to get a balance, try to take education from what people say. And I listen to all sides of the argument. I still sit here.
Where are you now, then? Well, ask me a question. I'll see if I can answer it. Ask me anything.
Well, the point I really want to try and emphasise today. So we're at this late stage impasse. We've got the government who need to make a decision. So they need to decide whether they're going to vote for a deal. Theresa May deal obviously sounds dead. They've voted for it 3 times. Is that correct? And it's dead.
Yeah. Yes.
So, is there going to be a no deal, a new deal presented, or are we going to put it back to a people's vote? But there's just this stalemate within government, and I sit here today and the lunacy that to get more democracy where you suspend Parliament is just crazy.
I know.
So someone who believes that Brexit was the right option, I can see why that is absolutely
Do you
crazy.
still believe that?
The Brexit, I'll, at the end, if you ask me my specifics, I'll tell you my specifics. What I'm calling for today is about where do we go from now, because we need something extreme to unlock it. But Boris Johnson is not the right person. The Conservative Party is not the right person.
Well, I'm going to regret saying this out loud, but the psychology and I would say the emotional and intellectual constitution of the two sides, and I'm generalising hugely. There'll be exceptions to this on both sides, so please don't think this is a binary or a black and white or a my team's the best in the world type observation. If it goes ahead, then all of the people who most furiously resisted it will be the people working hardest to make it work. That's the ultimate Brexit irony. You know, you could call it the Mark Carney principle. If it actually happens, then the people who are genuine patriots, the boring people, the details people, the dull people, the civil servants and the bureaucrats and the politicians who aren't on the telly every 10 minutes and who aren't trying to get you to pay £100 a month to join their latest vanity project, the ones who sadly the British media has not yet learned properly to accommodate, they will be the ones getting on with it. And that, at the moment, gives me a little bit of hope about no deal and the negativity and the badness of it being minimised. And, of course, then you have the next stage of that process is if they are successful, if they follow the Mark Carney principle and actually do successfully mitigate the consequences of actions they begged the country not to undertake, then they get attacked for being scaremongers and liars. I understand what you mean when you say it needs something massive, like a huge dose of salts or the mother of all laxatives to unblock this appalling impasse. But it's not going to happen for the reasons that you alluded to at the very, very beginning of the call, is there's nothing I can say that can persuade you that your football team is not the best in the world.
But something has to happen now. And
something will happen. Events, dear boy, events. But
if I can just explain...
Well, you can't, because it's 12:29. No. So if there was a vote tomorrow, leave or remain?
I don't know. I see if there's a deal, and that's...
No deal or no Brexit?
I think no Brexit.
Yeah, there you go. Got there in the end. Bless you. It's coming up to 12:30. It's coming up to James O'Brien on LBC. After the break, we'll be talking to Lord Kerr, the former chief diplomat, UK's chief diplomat, who, of course, authored the Article 50 legislation that set out the legal process for leaving the EU. The question I would love to hear answers to, but which I doubt anyone would indulge me, is this: how have you gone from believing that a vote for more democracy, more control and more powers for Parliament entails supporting the suspension of Parliament so that a Prime Minister elected by a tiny slither of the population can potentially force through legislation for which he has precisely no mandate? It's a weird little psychological conundrum, but of course we're so far down the rabbit hole that people won't be asking themselves that question. They'll simply be reading out whatever is on the script in front of them, and today the script says 17.4 million people voted for no deal, and anyone who points out that they didn't is some form of traitor. It's 12:35. Lord Kerr is the UK's former chief diplomat, member of the European Commission that drafted Article 50, and he joins me on the line now, I beg your pardon, the European Convention. What do you make of this morning's developments, Lord Kerr?
Well, I think it is a bit shocking. I agree with you. I think a parliamentary democracy requires Parliament to be allowed to sit. We've just been away for 4 weeks. We're still away, and we're going to be sent away, it seems, for another 5 weeks. I think the reason for that is so that we cannot probe what no deal means. We have had some indications of what no deal means in the leaked papers, about which the government lied, saying they were July papers from the old government. In fact, they were August papers of the new government, and they revealed that it was going to be very unpleasant. And I think they don't want that to be scrutinised. Mr. Johnson has had precisely 24 hours of parliamentary scrutiny since he became Prime Minister, and he wants to have 1 week now and then not see us again until the second half of October.
You used a phrase there that many people will perhaps have remarked, that you said the government lied. Are you surprised to find yourself confident to say things like that in public? And for people who don't know, you're currently, of course, a crossbench peer, so you're a member of Parliament.
Yes, I'm very surprised. I mean, I feel very sorry for the public services watching this going on. In my 36 years, I never told a lie in public service. It's a mistake to tell a lie because you tend to be found out and then people don't trust you again. But when Mr. Gove said the document that was leaked was a July document dating from the old government, he knew he was telling a lie. And one shouldn't do that. And the public service is supposed to keep its head down while the government tells fibs. That's not right.
Mr. Gove is, of course, more than welcome to a right of reply on this programme, should he feel the need to avail himself of that opportunity. We spoke some time ago about Article 50, and I just want to double-check that my memory is functioning properly, Lord Kerr. It was never really conceived as an instrument which would be employed in the way in which it has been employed. It was more the means by which the European Union could sort of get rid of a country that wasn't abiding by the spirit and the rules of the Union, as opposed to an instrument that a country that, for whatever reason, wanted to essentially expel itself.
Not quite,
no.
James. I mean, it was a voluntary withdrawal. It wasn't an expulsion clause. But the thinking behind it was that one might get a dictatorial regime in Eastern Europe who subscribed to all the ideals of the European Union when joining, and then started acting in a different way. For example, acting in an extra-parliamentary way, or acting against the rule of law, or locking up the press, or whatever. What would one do? There is another article which allows one, if everybody else agrees, to withdraw that member state's voting rights. Right. We thought, supposing we did that, that's never been done, but supposing we did that, what would the member state do? It would probably storm out in a huff.
Right.
If it stormed out in a huff, it would be very good to have a procedure for ensuring that there was a legitimate way of storming out, a way in which the rule of law was maintained, contract, it was clear which contract survived, which didn't, and so on. So a procedure for leaving in a huff, but still voluntary, was what we had in mind. It was never an expulsion clause, and it is now. I mean, the European Union, if Mr. Johnson has any alternative to the backstop to propose that makes sense and are different from the ones they've been looking at for the last year and a half, then of course they are saying, let him put them forward and we'll look at them. But so far he hasn't done that, and it is my view, and I think it's your view, that what he's trying to avoid is people examining in Parliament what no deal means, because he wants no deal to mean no detail. He doesn't want to tell us what it is he's up to. And I don't think that's the way parliamentary democracy works. I think it's an outrage.
I suppose objectively you're right, but subjectively, if the protection of the Conservative Party, or indeed the existential threat to the Conservative Party that's posed by UKIP and its successors, then Johnson's behaviour becomes at least comprehensible, if not in any way creditable.
Yes, exactly. But he's not Prime Minister of the Conservative Party. He's Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And that confers certain responsibilities. Yes. It seems to me that Parliament is likely to say it doesn't want to be prorogued for 5 weeks. Prorogation is a process that can be done in 24 hours. There's nothing wrong with deciding to prorogue Parliament and have a Queen's speech. Why not? Very good idea. But what is wrong is saying that he is going to not bring Parliament back for 5 weeks. And I would have thought a humble address to Her Majesty saying that we don't actually want to be sent away. It's a shame to drag the Queen into politics. But I think it is Mr. Johnson who's doing that. And I would expect next week Parliament to be making it very clear that he does not want to go. I believe it was because Johnson, or the government, came to realise that Parliament wasn't going to want to go away for 3 weeks of conference recess, that Parliament was going to say next week that he wanted to sit throughout September. I think it was because of that he has decided that he wants to send us away, not just through the rest of September, but the first half of October as well.
And it is, in your view, clearly to avoid scrutiny. I hesitate to ask you this question. What's the best-case scenario looking ahead?
That there is no doubt that the chances of no deal is quite high. Well, we have a government that, although it said there was a 1 in a million chance, is clearly playing for no deal.
That was a fortnight ago.
Yeah, and it wants, what it's trying to do now is get into a position where it can blame the EU for no deal, which is quite difficult to do. But I think that's what Johnson was trying at the economic summit at the G7. Where the best case scenario is, in my view, that we have an election and we have a second referendum and the country votes as the public opinion polls say it would vote now, which is now that it knows that the only form of departure that's an offer is the no-deal departure, which we were told in 2016 was absolutely out of the question, which we were told a fortnight ago was a 1 in a million chance. That is what the government wants to do. I think the country will vote, as the public opinion polls say, vote in favour of Remain. If the choice is no deal or Remain, I think there's no doubt that the country will vote to Remain. I think that Johnson will try very hard, for obvious reasons, to avoid giving us that choice. But that is the optimistic scenario. That is the best way out of this fix, in my view.
Many thanks indeed. As always, Lord Kerr of Kinlochard, the Scottish politician and former diplomat, sitting currently as a crossbench peer in the House of Lords and one of the architects of the European Convention that first drafted, one of the members of the European Convention that first drafted Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. Let's cross now to Tony Lloyd, who's the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary and the Labour MP for Rochdale. It took Mr. Corbyn a while to respond this morning, but let's park that observation. I'm sure there are reasons why that is. What's Labour going to do, Tony Lloyd?
Well, we're going to have to seize every minute of parliamentary time now. This is an outrage, isn't it? It's very interesting listening to Lord Kerr, a man of immense experience. I worked with him years ago when he was the head of our Foreign Office, but the really interesting points he makes there do border on the fact that what is taking place now is, if it's not unconstitutional, it is mangling a constitution. Our Parliament sat through the Blitz during the war. It sat through a time when Parliament sought to get rid of Neville Chamberlain and replace him with another Prime Minister. It's bizarre that we've reached a stage where the present Prime Minister thinks he can play fast and loose with the norms of parliamentary democracy. This isn't just about one issue. It's very dangerous as a precedent for the governance of this country. So we do have to make sure that there is the most massive pressure, both on obviously Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Clearly the role of the Speaker comes into this. The Speaker has powers. Ultimately, I do think Boris Johnson is involving the Queen in this row about Brexit, and that is very undesirable. It's not, I'm sure, what the Queen herself would want, or her advisors. It's not healthy for the nature of the democracy we've got. But that's where we're heading.
Well, it certainly looks that way. You could argue we're already there. So, I mean, I'm still a little unclear on what Plan A is for the Labour Party. I appreciate the desire to frustrate this process, or the desire to somehow use Parliament and parliamentary time to scrutinise and ideally to postpone or prevent no deal. But in terms of what's actually going to happen on the floor of the House when you reconvene, what's the plan?
Well, we've got to see, firstly, I mean, what is the plan from the government? Because in the end, the answer to your question is to use parliamentary devices, and it is, I've got to be a bit boring and technical. It's talking to the people at the parliamentary clerks who are experts in parliamentary procedure as to how we can use the various devices in Parliament to frustrate this process. Now, we're not going to be able to get to grips with that within a few hours of this. What is a bit of a
fair enough.
bombshell? I mean,
yes, of course
people knew that the government were planning. You'll remember, as of yesterday, the government were denying it was going to prorogue Parliament. Now, the accusation of distrustful behaviour is one that gets bandied around, but goodness me, if this isn't distrustful behaviour, goodness knows what.
Well, I had Lord Kerr on the line just before you, accusing Michael Gove of lying in the boldest and the strongest of terms, a position which he himself was surprised to find himself in. And apropos that observation, Tony Lloyd, before you go, a little quiz for you. Who do you think said this as in the dim and distant past on June the 26th, 2019? I am not attracted to archaic devices like proroguing. Let's get this thing done as a proud representative democracy.
I suspect it was the Prime Minister.
My God, you're good at this.
I might be horribly wrong.
You know you're not, and I can confirm it was indeed Boris Johnson. I'm sorry to cut you off in your prime, but I'm already a little late for this. Tony Lloyd, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary and the Labour MP for Rochdale, many thanks. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. I'm still reeling from Lord Kerr, an eminently and indeed a famously measured, erudite and informed individual, reaching for that word lying in describing Michael Gove's latest interventions on Brexit. Michael Gove, of course, I played you earlier, his descriptions of no deal. It's almost as if he's completely forgotten. Jo Swinson is the newly minted leader of the Liberal Democrats and, of course, the MP for East Dunbartonshire. She joins me on the line now. What do you make of this morning's developments, Jo?
I think it's just outrageous. We've basically got a Prime Minister who is on some kind of power trip, who is throwing aside all types of balances and checks that are there in order to prevent people running away with power. And I mean, this is the man who said he wanted to be world king, but he's not world king. He's Prime Minister of our country. He should be accountable to the people through Parliament, and he has very little mandate. He was elected by a tiny, tiny proportion of the population to be Prime Minister, less than 0.1% of our country. And he's pursuing an action which will cause grave harm, shortages of food and medicines, which people didn't vote for. And that he's then saying that he will not just, refuse to listen to people. He will silence their representatives, and basically just he's off on a power trip, thinking he's world king. And we have to stop this. I mean, I've written to the Queen today. I think it is horrendous that he.
Well, what have you said to the Queen?
Forcing us. Well, I've asked to meet to explain the great concerns that we have about this prorogation, because ultimately it is a royal prerogative and a royal action. But I mean, for so many years, the way our constitution has worked is that the Queen is a constitutional monarch and does not get involved and is not placed in this kind of invidious position.
So just to be clear, are you asking her to say no to the Prime Minister?
Well, I think that we should have Parliament sitting to be able to hold the government to account, and the Prime Minister is trying to remove the voice of the people at a crucial moment in our country's history. There's 64 days, that's all, between now and the potential of us crashing out of the European Union. And with this, so basically sending MPs home for, extra weeks, He's proposing that Parliament sits for, a dozen or 15 days in the next 64. I mean, does that make sense at a time of, significant national emergency? Frankly, whatever your views are on Brexit, that we shouldn't have any checks and balances on this Prime Minister who, hasn't got the support of the country because it's only been a tiny number of people that have even had a say in him becoming Prime Minister.
You may not like this, but I just wonder if you could perhaps imagine a modicum of sympathy for Boris Johnson's position and the sort of barbarians at the gate for the entire Conservative Party represented by Farage's mob. He's trying to juggle quite a lot of balls, and this could see off Farage in the short term, and possibly permanently, and potentially open the door to a sort of withdrawal agreement plus that he will then spook Parliament into passing, because the threat of no deal, which was supposed to terrify the European Union, has ended up terrifying the British Parliament that voted against Theresa May's withdrawal agreement 3 times.
But, I mean, James,
Discuss.
I know you're trying to play devil's advocate here. But no, I don't have sympathy for Boris Johnson, because he should not be being motivated by what is in the best interest of the Conservative Party. He is not only leader of the Conservative Party, he is Prime Minister of our country, and his primary duty should be to protect, to look after, to be a good steward for our country and for the country's future.
Yes.
And he is propelling us towards an appalling state of events where British government policy, forces people into a situation where they're not sure what food they'll get in the supermarket, and they're not sure whether their prescription will get filled, right? He should be putting the national interest first. This is not about the interests, or it should not be about the interests of the Conservative Party. And unfortunately, that is the way that he has approached this from the word go. When he decided which side to back in the referendum, because, he said he could go either way. When he ran for leadership of the Conservative Party, and he said whatever he felt he needed to say to win that election, even when those things were contradictory, and
yes.
Putting this country in this course, he is not motivated by what's in the best interest of our country, and that is why he's taking us down this disastrous path, and why we will not stand by and let him do that, because the voice of people in this country must be heard. It cannot be silenced.
And, of course, there is the nub of the problem. Some people think the voice of the people was heard in 2016. Some people think that the voice of the people is the one that is uttered by their representatives in Parliament. Either way, as Joe Swinson, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, explained, this is unprecedented. It's quite remarkable in so many ways. Many thanks, Joe Swinson, for your time. Do you know, listening to Joe Swinson there, something occurred to me. I've said to you since June the 2016, and oddly, perhaps to some ears, it is sincere. I love finding things upon which everyone can agree, even in the context of Brexit, and they're very, very few and far between, but things upon which everyone can agree. And do you know, that's what's happened today. Everyone agrees that Boris Johnson is suspending Parliament in order to get, or to increase the chances of getting a no-deal Brexit through without scrutiny. Does anyone disagree with that? It's been pointed out that we've heard from most political parties and not really from the government. That's not quite fair. I played you a clip of Michael Gove. I'm delighted to tell you now that the Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, is poised to share his views on proroguing Parliament.
And then there's this idea from some people, you might have heard of it, there's this idea from some people that to deliver Brexit, we should suspend our parliamentary democracy, that we should prorogue Parliament. But that goes against everything that those men who waded onto those beaches fought and died for. And I will not have it.
Well, presumably, Matt Hancock will be announcing his resignation from Boris Johnson's cabinet in the course of Sheila Fogarty's programme this afternoon, because that is precisely what Boris Johnson has just done. And you heard him yourself, I will not have it. Curiouser and curiouser. I leave that with you. It's a fascinating observation. We can't agree on anything, but we can actually agree on this today. Boris Johnson is suspending Parliament in order to increase his chances of getting a no deal through without any scrutiny. So if you're on the other side of the argument from me, you have to ask yourself, why doesn't he want any scrutiny?